Hello, guys and gals, me Mutahar, and you know what I love? Hacking game systems. Now, this is my Switch OLED, ladies and gentlemen, playing some Borderlands on it. Now, the thing about it is, I love hacking pretty much every system that I get, and when it comes to my channel, I made plenty of videos throughout my channel's history where I've dug out older systems and I've hacked them, okay? I've hacked the original 3DS, I've even showed you how to hack a 3DS, and I still think you should. It's probably one of the best handhelds that you can have. I've shown you guys how to hack the Sony PlayStation Vita, one of the best handheld systems that Sony has made and Sony has abandoned. Like some goddamn redheaded stepchild, alright? It's crazy shit. And boys, when it comes to the original PSP, I'm gonna be real with you, if it wasn't for this, I probably wouldn't watch half the YouTubers that really inspired me, and I honest to God probably wouldn't have played a lot of video games that have really stuck near and dear to me. Hacking a PSP back in the day meant that I could watch YouTube videos. It meant that I could, play games that were in the homebrew sense. It meant that I could not only play PSP games, but for a while it was the best gosh darn Game Boy Advance that I could actually get my hand on. I mean, seriously, when I had a hacked PSP and some of my friends actually still rocked the Game Boy Advance playing Advance Wars, it was crazy to have a handheld PSP that not only had a better screen, but if you had a big enough Memory Stick Pro Duo, yes, that's what Sony used to call those memory sticks back in the day, you could stick pretty much every Game Boy Advance game worth caring about into the actual PlayStation Portable and still have room left for some goddamn GTA Liberty City stories. Now, obviously, I've even hacked consoles. I've hacked the Xbox 360 that I own. I've actually hacked around with my Nintendo Wii U, which I actually showed you how to do. So I even hacked the original Nintendo Switch. Now, back in the day, hacking the original Nintendo Switch was not necessarily difficult. Nintendo released the Switch as a Tegra chipset device, and there was one hardware, hack that people could achieve. Basically, if you took out one of the Joy-Cons on your actual old-school Switch, and you stuck in a little device that would actually, short, I believe, one of the pins down over here, you could put your device into RCM mode. And in RCM mode, you could then launch custom firmware. So hacking the actual original Nintendo Switch was just us as gamers being incredibly lucky. Nintendo, and by extension Nvidia, left a hardware exploit in the device, or I guess they never really thought that it would be left in. Gamers found it, and literally within launch time, the actual system actually started to get hacked and played around with. Now, I don't think the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be that easy. So I've seen a lot of people say that apparently it's going to be impossible. The Nintendo Switch 2 is unhackable right now. Scanning the chip bricks it due to voltage detection. Once it bricks, Nintendo calls you and demands a fee. Refuse to pay, see you in small claims court. Nintendo is not playing around. Do not try to hack this console. Now I remember back in the day when the PlayStation 3 dropped, I think it was Sony that said it's an unhackable system. And I think for like 3-4 years it actually was pretty unhackable until it wasn't. Now, hacking a PlayStation 3 is actually so trivial that no matter what generation of PlayStation 3 you own, I highly recommend you hack it. One of my PlayStation 3s, my prized gaming possession, in all honesty, is a totally backwards compatible PlayStation 3. It has the original PS2 hardware inside it. I ended up picking it up, cleaned it out, replaced the drives, and I hacked it so that I can not only have a PlayStation 3, that's moddable, but I also have access to a, upscaled, from official Sony sources, PlayStation 2 and by extension PlayStation 1 that can run basically any game, all right? It's actual original hardware that is completely supercharged by hacking the goddamn device, okay? It's probably one of the best systems that you can have. You would probably not be bored of gaming for a long time if you had a hacked PlayStation 3. Now, of course, when it comes to hacking other systems, I've hacked even the original Xbox as well, which is basically a system that is best enjoyed as long as you've completely hacked the dashboard on that system. So let's dive into some of the Switch 2 points. So one user, Laguna Loire 88 on gbatemp.net, I'm sure that brings some memories for some people. Some hackers got their hands on the Switch 2. Okay, so some hackers got their hands on that Switch 2 device. Let's pretend this is the Switch 2. So they used a mix switch. They tested it and it immediately locks out the Switch 2, turning it into a brick, and it ends up boot looping. So first off, there's no verified claim or source for this. This could easily just basically be somebody from Nintendo feeding misinformation, but I wouldn't be surprised. For anybody that doesn't know what a make switch is, a make switch, if I actually have it right here, yeah, this is a mix switch that I'm holding right over here. Now, granted, I don't think this device is entirely completely legal, but the concept over here is, if you can look very quickly, is you can put video games into this side SD card slot, and as long as you can put it into an actual Nintendo Switch, you can, in theory, launch games from a physical cart like this. So of course, if that is put into a Switch 2, apparently you might be actually warranting a brick on the device. Now, number 2 is testers that prod the flash storage of the ROM chip, it immediately locks out the Switch 2, turning it into a brick. So again, when people had started to jump into the flash storage of the actual onboard chip, maybe to mess around with it, the Switch 2 detects has some weird protection that can find voltage changes, which any tool will cause when you start to fuck around with the chip, even if it's minor, which I don't necessarily believe. Small deviances are to, I guess, somewhat be expected. But again, this is a completely unverified source. So unless an exploit is found and doesn't result in a brick when implemented, it won't happen in a long time. So this mystery man knows 3 testers that were working on hardware and software modding and know what they were doing, just find that any work immediately bricks it, and Nintendo gives a troubleshooting step to reload the firmware from an SD card, but it's stuck in boot looping. So again, we don't even know how these Switch 2s are working. Again, these may not even be the systems that are shipped to the actual end user, if the story is true at all, which I don't think it fucking is. In the end, it had to return to Nintendo, and they no longer allow to be testers. They have to pay for the consoles, otherwise it'll go to small claims court, as it has some form of internal reporting that unauthorized use was made, which that isn't surprising. I think most devices that you use, I believe when it comes to cell phones, right? Like Samsung smartphones have like a security enclave, which if you start to fuck around with the firmware too much, it'll lock you out from the security enclave. So a lot of those security features, like phone payment, like the Samsung Pay, a lot of that stuff ends up getting locked out. So that doesn't really shock me if true. Apparently another tester had an early access to a game and it crashed and rebooted and no longer worked until they reinstall a firmware. So it may be a sign that an exploit triggers a reboot to run unsigned code is out of the question, as the firmware will refuse to run and needs a clean firmware. And also, FYI, reinstalling firmware from SD cards is not offline. It's a generic app that only connects to a Nintendo server, which that, if true, scares me more, okay? I really think that it's important that a lot of these systems give you the ability to reinstall system firmware from like your own sources, because that could be a serious right to repair problem if, for instance, Nintendo servers do go offline or they become unavailable or something goes awry. How the fuck are you supposed to reinstall firmware to your device if the internet connectivity isn't functional, okay? Like, that should be a basic fix most systems allow you to do, all right? At least in my opinion. Now, of course, obviously, the entire board is laughing their ass off. No source at all. And yeah, why should there be a source, okay? None of these people are actually believing anything here. Now, I feel like there's a lot of people that don't want the Switch 2 to be hacked, and I do definitely understand it. I think Nintendo is taking hacking so seriously because if you have to remember, hacking a Switch was trivially easy, right? Like when the systems launched initially, as long as you had a launch day Nintendo Switch, you could launch those original RCM exploits and basically run pirated video games, pirated homebrew. But what you don't know is the original Switch, ladies and gentlemen, had the ability to do a lot more things than actually just play pirated video games. There were tools like Laka, which were like entire operating systems that you could install alongside the inbuilt Horizon, so you could get access to, again, a purely emulating based like operating system on the device. There was also ways for you to install Android on the actual Switch, because remember, this is a Tegra chipset. It was relatively simple to boot into Android, and then you could play some Android games, you could run applications, you could browse the web, you could actually have serious tablet functionality with Android. Now, obviously, the speed of it was probably not something worth doing, just simply because most modern smartphones, like especially mid-range Android devices, honestly, at this point, even the low-end Android devices, forget the super high-end Android devices, will probably easily outclass this super old tablet with technology from 2013. And obviously, with modern Android devices, you could even run things like PC games. Like, I'm not gonna blow your mind here, but there is actually ways for you to run games like Grand Theft Auto 5, the Legacy Edition, on an actual smartphone, and it runs at a pretty playable frame rate. There's even phones now that are launching with full PC emulator, so you can play your PC games on your Android device, okay? Which is, again, if you're ever an Android person, there are some serious boons to having Team Green as opposed to Fisher-Price iOS. But this is not the battleground for it. The point of this is that Nintendo Switch 1 was actually a system, in my opinion, really worth hacking, okay? If I was back in the days of being a high schooler where the PSP was my way to play any sort of like video games that were outside the scope of the PSP, or watch YouTube, or get access to, again, the online world that was sort of brimming at the time, the Switch would be an amazing hack for me. But the reality is, ever since devices like the Steam Deck, and to be honest, ever since I've had a smartphone, my desire to hack these devices has kind of just dwindled. With honestly a lot of emulation nowadays, I really don't have a reason to have a hacked Switch, because even if I wanted to run games on the hacked Switch, it would always just be easier and less of a headache to fire up an emulator, throw in a ROM, and then maybe run some patches to up the resolution to like 4K, up the frame rate to like 60, maybe even 120 frames, and then just play my video games. Now, interestingly, the thing about hacking a Switch 2, which comes to my mind personally, is what about the emulation capability of Switch 2? When is that possibly going to come out? Because here's the thing, from a personal perspective, the Switch 2 seems to be, on paper, a lot more powerful, at least it seems, from the other handheld gaming PCs that exist. It also runs on the ARM chipset, meaning that it's a lot more performant, it's a lot more like understanding of battery life, and it's definitely going to be a device that should, in theory, run cooler. It's going to be a much more efficient device in the hand. So being able to run a lot of my emulators on it, which at this point, from my understanding, even emulators like RPCS3, the PS3 emulator, can run on ARM-based systems. So I am excited to see like how the emulation would look on a Switch 2, but I'm also wondering how emulation is going to look on the actual Switch 2 running on a PC. Now, when people say that a system isn't hackable, for instance, you really just have to get lucky. There's no system that is unhackable. If Nintendo came out tomorrow and said, the Switch 2 is not going to be hacked, again, there are systems that have not been hacked. There are systems like the Xbox One and the Xbox Series system that still to this day are not modded or hacked in that traditional sense. There are ways for you to run developer mode on an Xbox and run third-party applications, but generally speaking, running pirated video games, running unauthorized software, unauthorized emulators in the retail mode of the actual Xbox One and the Series is not possible because Microsoft is just a several generational step above Sony and Nintendo when it comes to that. But let's be honest, even the PlayStation 5 isn't really that much of a slouch. Since the days of the PlayStation 2, a lot of money and a lot of actual time has been spent upping the security of these systems. So you have DVD-based security, you've had full operating system security, you've had full cryptography, you've had sandboxing. Hell, nowadays we're in the moment where we're using hypervisors to prevent people hacking our systems. But back in the day when Sony used to say the PlayStation 3 wasn't hackable because they had that custom cell processor, they had a hypervisor, which again was used as a security gap to prevent people from modifying things above a certain level. They would have encrypted keys. They would basically fight against mod chips. Mod chips back in the days of the PlayStation 2 was effectively the biggest killer when it comes to piracy, right? Like back when I was growing up, there were moments where I learned about mod chips, and you could put a mod chip on your PlayStation 2 where it would then skip those CD checks, those DVD checks, and just boot burned DVDs. A lot of people used to have it back in the day, and they came out rapidly, like literally within the console's like launch period. But with the PlayStation 3, what had effectively happened was, for a while, it actually was pretty locked down. For 3 to 4 years of its lifespan, Sony was right. They literally were unable to hack the PlayStation 3. Nobody could get into it. But of course, as time goes on, people like George Hotz had discovered that literally inside the PlayStation 3 there were possible exploits with other OS, and of course Sony decided to remove that just to kill the possibility of that happening. But of course, down the road, it did not stop GeoHot. He went down even further and found that there was ways to break the hypervisor access. So of course, down the road, a hacking group known as Fail Overflow discovered a pretty massive blunder. Sony, in all of their security, had reused the same number in what is known as the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm for signing their firmware. So what it meant was that allowed hackers to effectively rebuild the private keys that Sony had used, and I believe it was the MET LDR root key. So at this moment in time, once you had access to those keys, the system is effectively compromised. So that moment in time, George Hotz released what is, at the time, one of the first custom firmwares for the PlayStation 3. And that allowed people to run unsigned applications, so things like pirated games, and obviously homebrew. Now, of course, that's just the history of PlayStation 3, but down when it came to the Nintendo Switch, again, hacking it was even easier, because what had happened was we got lucky with the exploit already in the system, which is not something that we're going to get lucky with as the Switch 2 drops. And I'm just going to be completely honest with you there. I'm sure a lot of time and money has been spent in obviously ensuring that that Switch 2 is not going to suffer the same fate as the Switch 1, where games, not only was piracy a big problem, but obviously, let's be honest, games being dumped a few days before release and showing up on 4chan was obviously something that pissed off Nintendo more than you can imagine. Now, when it came to emulating the original Switch, I believe in less than, a year, the actual first emulator started showing up. Emulators like Yuzu and then later Ryujinx, right? So Yuzu came from the guys that made Citra, which was the 3DS emulator, and it would be able to fire up the actual operating system for the Switch. And obviously, as time went on, booting commercial games, independent games, it started to happen more and more and more. And very rapidly, you went from, booting the Switch menu to being able to play the latest releases at higher resolutions and higher frame rates than the actual Switch could ever even dream of doing. Now, we know that Nintendo obviously legally went after these emulators to the point where they're effectively being completely dropped. It's like whack-a-mole on the internet, and it shouldn't be something that really shocks anyone. Now, obviously, when it comes to the Switch 2, in my personal experience and in my honest opinion here, I don't think emulating it is going to be that fast either. Again, given that the actual device, it seems, is not something that people know, it is definitely NVIDIA based, but it definitely feels like NVIDIA and Nintendo are doing a lot more of sitting down together and actually designing this piece of hardware as it ships out, which is why it's got some really cool features and techniques in it that are actually kind of mind-boggling for, again, this next generation of hardware, right? I'm actually kind of excited to see how the Switch 2 is going to perform throughout, because, again, it's a ARM-based tablet with a lot of those modern ray tracing quirks. It's got a lot of that DLSS stuff. It really feels like they're doing a lot with NVIDIA's power set to really push the power of this device and basically make sure that it has maybe even a longer lifespan than the original Switch. Now, again, if Nintendo cares at all about killing piracy, which is obviously their first goal, and killing emulation, then it's going to have a lot of effort put in with its cryptographic keys. It's going to have a lot to do with encryption, and it's going to have a lot to do with Nintendo finding ways to prevent people from cracking the system's firmware and starting to dump the actual games and have them floating all over the internet, okay? So there's a lot of pitfalls to kind of go through, but when it comes to the ultimate question, will the Switch 2 be hacked? Absolutely. There is not a single device that I really know of, other than the Xbox systems, that are not hacked in a traditional sense. It's really only just a matter of time. But I think unless we end up getting lucky in a few days where the Switch 2 drops and somehow, in some capacity, there is a hardware exploit that is baked into millions of Switches that are going out into the market, if that happens, holy shit, will I laugh till the ends of the earth, because that'll mean that there is going to be a lot more emulation. There's going to be a lot more hacking a lot quicker than expected. But given the fact that obviously Nintendo has already went through the slap to the face, I don't think that they're going to be shipping these devices out with problems. And honestly, with the amount of devices that have actually even been leaked, I probably, if it was that easy, might have expected to see some breakthrough already. But, or maybe it's just being kept under wraps until the device actually drops, which means like Nintendo would not be able to recall these as quickly. And I'm also pretty sure that when it comes to, again, patching out vulnerabilities and having a tighter control, I'm sure Nintendo's already got that kind of stuff locked down. But yeah, the Switch 2, it's going to be a lot harder to hack. But don't let anybody tell you it's going to be impossible. There's been a lot of companies in the world that have said, you'll never be able to hack our systems, until the systems ended up being hacked. But ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it. I am out.